So what I've got here is basically, I've gone through and kind of written down some information about projects we've been working on. As I said, I'm going to make that a lab brief. So, the lab side. So we've got some information there, and some information about the stuff we still need to do today. So just some reminders about how we kind of got. We should have about 5 pages. Yeah. This is basically the lab assignment that we've been working. Thank you. So we've got the screen mock-up in there on about page 3 or 4. It's kind of the, remember that's kind of our end goal. We're going for this, and we're kind of part way through it, right? So, yeah. So you'll kind of remember that yesterday we were working with this kind of area, and we were making sure we kind of split things up and move things around. So we've got like a cart list and a cart item, and we've moved most of that logic. Remember, we previously had put into the cart item. We kind of bubbled it up and moved it into the cart list, right? So that's where we've kind of are doing our work right now. One thing I need to remember to do, let me share that link. So there's some items I kind of called out on Discord in terms of things we haven't done yet and what's on our plan. So there's kind of like 7 bullet points for what we're going to do today. Bring that over here. So we need to talk about the disabled button, the disabled buttons, which we kind of concluded with yesterday. I had you kind of make that little code change, but I want to talk about it briefly. We still need to add, I want to do some stuff with how do we do dynamic classes, which is kind of related to that. So we'll do some dynamic classes for the name field. So that changes based on whether the name field is blank or not. We're going to add that counter up to the header. So we want to add this total count that says how many things are in your cart. That's the third thing we want to do in there. We want to implement this button, add new things to the cart, and I want to add some way to remove things. Kind of conversely, we can add things, we can remove things. So what we're going to do is this lets you add something. If you decrement something down to 0, we're going to then remove it from the cart. Okay? So we're doing both of those kinds of things. Once we do that, you'll also notice, well, something happens, once you empty the cart completely, it's not particularly convenient. So things we want to do when the cart is empty is hide that number up here, as well as show the user some sort of error message down here. So it's also going to kind of show us how do we deal with things like visibility. Cool. So that's kind of the overall view there, and then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time to talk about CSS. Cool. For tomorrow, there's a Lab 6.2, which I'll and off to Evan, and that's what I want you guys to work on tomorrow is lab 6.2. So we'll hopefully finish up 6.1 today, and then you guys can work on 6.2 tomorrow, which will be on your issue copy. Okay, so let's dive into it. I'm going to bring up this project again. So I'm back into my issue tracker, not my issue tracker, back to my shopping cart. Okay, make sure this is all good. NPM start to start it running again. That should fire up in a second or two. Okay, so that's where we're at. I'm going to hit F12 to make sure I've got the debugging tools back up, so we're watching for anything there. And pull that down, jump back in mobile mode. Okay. So first things first, where we left off. We said that when the quantity reaches 10, we want to disable the add button, and when the quantity gets down to 0, we want to disable the minus button. And most of you got there. I think pretty much everybody did. There was some gotchas there, right? And so some people tried to do it a different way before kind of landing on the right way. One of the things to keep in mind when we're working with React, as we said at the outset, is that we want to do this in a declarative fashion rather than an imperative fashion, which means that we don't go say, hey, when you click this button, then change the DOM, change the UI in this way or such and such. We're only saying, here's how you change the data and letting React actually update the UI. Does that make sense? So that's important. Is we never manually update the UI. We're always dealing with the React updating the UI based on changes to the state. Okay? So changing the state causes a rerun. That's helpful for a lot of reasons. Part of that is that you may have other things that cause that state to change. So like the quantity might not just change because you're hitting the plus and minus button. It might happen because maybe you're doing something on another tab. Maybe another user is modifying the data. Maybe you're not the only user modifying the data. Maybe there's something else that can cause it to happen. Or more specifically, well, what happens if you need to load the page and there's already data there? And that, in that case, you want to make sure that when you load the page is kind of the same as when you're working and modifying the data. And if you're doing things imperatively, it's very easy for those things to be distinct. Where the way I get to the state, or way I get to the state, the path that I take to get there can change how the UI looks, right? Which is kind of the problem that we're trying to solve. We want to say that the way the UI looks has nothing to do with how I got to that state. It's only concerned with what the state is, right? So I can for sure say if the data is in this state, then the UI looks this way. Okay? So the thing we don't do is we don't go to here and say, okay, if you change the quantity, then we're going to disable the button. Because that also leads you into things like, well, what about when the page loads? What about the data that's initially there? What if one of those was already at 10 or already at 2, right? Then that button wouldn't be disabled. I would have to duplicate that code when the page loads. Does that make sense? Or in whatever other events that make that happen. So what we do is we kind of declaratively say, what are the conditions for that property being true or false? So I go into this button here, and I say, okay, it's disabled, either true or false, right? So disabled is true, it's disabled is false, it's not. And so what we landed on was that I want to say when the item dot quantity is greater than or equal to 10, then you can't add things. Then it's disabled. And similarly for the other side, if you get down to 0 or negative, I'll get to you in a minute, we want to say item dot quantity is less than or equal to 0, right? So those were the two changes that we made there. Now, you had a hand up.
So is there a way, because essentially this would be like assuming everything can have a max quantity of 10. So what if there's items that maybe have a larger max quantity?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question. So what if not everything has a limit of 10? Well, an easy way to solve that would be just say, hey, there's another property. So I might say item dot max quantity. And I would just add something else to the data. I would say, well, every item has a maximum quantity, and so that would be set further up. That would be set in the cart list or wherever we retrieve it, probably in the database. So in the database, we would say this product or whatever has a maximum quantity, and I would just read it in here. That's how I would solve that. So pretty easy. Basically, the component doesn't deal with it. Is the gotcha. Cool. All good? Okay. So I'm going to go back to 10. So that kind of makes sense, right? So I just declaratively say, if the quantity is 10 or greater, it's disabled. If it's 0 or less, it's disabled. In that way, I don't care how it got there. Anything could have caused it to the quantity to be 10. Anything could have caused the quantity to be 0. I don't care how it got there, but it's disabled. Cool. And this is where we talk about this is declarative instead of imperative. I declare that it should be disabled in these conditions. I don't say this happens and therefore it's disabled. Okay. So on a similar vein, the next thing I wanted to look at is oftentimes we may want to do a little bit of validation on our form fields. For instance, we might typically want to say, okay, if this field is blank, right, that's an invalid field. If it's got a name in it, then it is valid, right? So there's actually two classes in Bootstrap that we can apply. There is an isValid field, isValid class, as well as an isInvalid class. Okay, so I want to show you what those look like, and then we'll look at how we can do that dynamically. So I'm going to go up to the name field. I'm going to add the class first, is-valid. Okay, so when I mark that field as isValid, you'll see that it appears in green with the checkbox, right? So we want to look that way if the field's not blank. On the flip side, if it is blank, we're going to add the class isInvalid, and it will look like this. So it's got a red outline with the little exclamation marks on it. Okay? Is everybody good with that? So that's what I want to do. This is a really common thing that comes up, that you might dynamically want to change the classes. It's a little bit nuanced because there's some things you might not think about. Okay? So how do I make that happen? How do I make that dynamic? What comes to mind? How do I make that class change? Anybody?
What is the checkbox that you use?
So it's isValid or isInvalid.
What is the check?
We're just putting that class on. So we have to check it. We have to say, is the field blank? Okay, is the name blank? The name is empty string. right? Like if the name is empty string, then we're going to show it as invalid. If it's not empty string, I'm going to show it as valid.
So can we just say like if item.name is an empty string would be invalid?
Okay. Now you see the term if. Remember, we're in the middle of a statement, so I can't inject an if statement here.
So then we say like item name equal to empty string, and then it would be invalid.
Right. So first and foremost, right, if I want to write JavaScript, what do I have to do? Curly braces, right? Okay. So let's say I start by just doing that. Let's say I put curly braces here. Notice that those curly braces are in green. Okay. Curly braces in green. It's ignoring them. So we're not in JavaScript world, but if I just add curly braces here, this is one of those gotchas, right? I can't just add them in the middle of the string. So what else can I do? How do I get into JavaScript land? That's question number one, right? Because I have to put some code there.
You write class name equals again instead of putting inside the brace line to start with curly braces again?
Maybe just start with curly braces. So like you're saying, what if I put this whole thing in curly braces?
No, I'm talking about writing out again. Writing out class name again.
I can't. Yeah, I can't set class name twice. I can only set the class name once. So I can't put them just inside the one part of the string where I want it to be dynamic. I have to wrap the entire property and make the whole property dynamic. Okay, does that make sense? So the curly braces don't really function per se as a string replacement. This is not really a string. We're saying that this class name is some sort of expression as a whole. So I have to say the whole property is an expression. Okay, so that helps, right? So I can start with that, and then I can add things in, right? So remember that we've got kind of two techniques. We've got two different techniques for combining or making strings dynamic. What were those two techniques? I can use concatenation or a template string. So I can solve this. I can make this dynamic using either of those techniques. Let me take a look at both, and we can kind of see which one we like better. Okay. So I'm going to start with concatenation first. Okay. So if I say concatenation, I'm going to say plus, and then I'm going to say, okay, well, let's say what this is the thing I'm adding. Well, we've got some sort of condition, right? We have a condition of whether or not there is a name. And so commonly I would do that like this, just item.name, right? Because it's either truthy or falsy. They either have a name or they don't have a name, right? So if they have a name, remember we can't really put if statements in the middle here, but I can put what? Remember, we're an expression. We can put a ternary. Right? So oftentimes, actually, in React, we use ternaries a lot more than if statements, is one of the things to kind of realize. We actually use ternaries a lot more often because we're often in expression land and not in statement land. So because we're here, I would say if the item name is there, then I want to give it one class. Otherwise, I want to give it a different class. So we might say, okay, well, if the item name's there, I want to give it is valid or is invalid. So that's one thing you can do. Is you can say, okay, we'll kind of put an expression in there, and that'll work. You do have to be careful with your spaces. So, for instance, we have to make sure that there's a space between all the classes. So I've added it here in this case. But sometimes that means sometimes you end up having to add the spaces in other places. So do pay attention to the fact that the classes still need to have spaces between them, because that can be easy to miss. Okay, so if I just try that out, okay, we can see that that's checked once I get back down. And this is kind of where the benefit of this declarative method comes in, right? You notice I didn't have to change any of the code that is involved with changing the name, okay? It automatically refreshes, right? I just have to say, well, what are the conditions for it being this class or another class, right? So it could be a bunch of different ways to change the name or modify the name, but I just have to change it in one place. So everybody good with that? Okay. So if I wanted to do this with a template string, and comment this out, it kind of would start with a similar thing. Remember that I need to put backticks around it. Okay. And then you remember anytime I want to put in kind of my custom code, I need to put in a $sign and curly braces. Now this gets kind of interesting and a little bit tricky, because outside here, we're in XML land. We introduced these curly braces to get into JavaScript land. The backticks put us kind of into a string, and then we're using this to escape back to JavaScript land. So we're kind of escaping to JavaScript land, leaving it, and coming back. So it can get a little bit interesting. Okay. But this is one way we can do that. It turns out that it's almost kind of identical to the other way. I still need to use a ternary. So it still becomes a case of what goes into there is the same thing I have in the parentheses above. So I can either do it this way with the template string, or you can do it the former way with string concatenation. Either is valid, and honestly, in this case, I don't know which one's easier to read. I think figuring out spaces is a little bit easier with template strings, just personally, but I don't know that it honestly makes much difference which of those two routes you go. Everybody good with that? Cool? Okay. Now, another thing that commonly happens, and so this is how we change classes. If we want to change classes, we don't manually change them in event handlers, we change them in the declaration of the name. There's a third way that I commonly do this, especially because this is already started to get pretty long. You're kind of seeing that. And if I wanted to add another class in here that's, say, dynamic, which oftentimes happens, you might want to say there might be more than one. There might be quite a bit more complexity to how you pick the class. This can get pretty cumbersome. Is that very good with that? This can get pretty cumbersome. So I'm going to show you a third way to do the same thing. And this is the way that I commonly end up doing things. So I might go back here and I think about this again. I say class name, and I kind of start thinking to myself, I'm like, well, as that code gets more complicated, maybe I don't want to have that code be here at all. Maybe I actually want to take this code and extract it somewhere else, right? So common technique which we have for extracting code elsewhere are functions, right? We can put functions in the middle here. I can call a function. And so commonly that's what we'll do. So what I can say is, well, let's come up with a function that has that purpose. Maybe we call it get name input class or classes. You see what I called it over on my other side, because I'm forgetting what exactly I called that. Yeah, that's what I called it. So I can say, well, let's call a function here, and then I can move that logic out. Does that make sense? So oftentimes you're going to use this trick, not just for classes, but for a lot of different things, where the way that you come up with the field may be sufficiently, where you need to come up with that value, may be sufficiently complex that it kind of merits writing a function for it. So everybody good with that? Merits writing a function for it. So I'm going to move this up further, and I'm going to go in here. I'm going to say, let's define that function. Function get name input classes, right? So that function just needs to return a string of the classes that that component has, right? So if we think about how to build that out, well, I know first of all that it has to have these classes to start with. It has to have cart item name, form control, okay? So I can start maybe with this. I can say let classes is equal to that starting point. To say, well, it has to have those classes. I can do something in between, and I can return the classes, right? So I start with, these are the classes that it always has, dynamically change that string, and then return the finished thing. So now that I'm in a function, I can actually use if statements, right? Now that I'm in a function, I can use if statements, I can use for loops, I can use all your traditional coding because I've left the world of expressions. We work down here in instructions, I'm back now down to statements. And so that can be another way to, another help anytime you've got something that's more complex, okay? And so oftentimes we'll add additional helper functions like this to facilitate that logic. Okay, so I could put an if statement in here. I'm going to go ahead and use a ternary again because I still find this easier to write as a ternary. I say classes plus equals. We're going to append something. Then what I'm going to say I'm going to append is kind of the logic we had below. So item.name, question mark. If the name is there, then it is valid. Otherwise, it is invalid. Oh, and I need a space in there for both of those. So if I look at that, cool. Same functionality, just a different way of writing that same functionality. So all of those techniques are useful, right? Sometimes concatenation is easier to read and work with. Sometimes your string, template strings are going to be easier. Sometimes it's going to be easier to just extract it to a function and write it that way. Cool. Everybody good with that? And Dawn, you were doing something with classes yesterday. Does that kind of answer how to do that now? You just move it into the component where the classes need to be dynamic, and you've got a few different ways to do that. So this comes up a lot, right? Anything that needs to be dynamic, anything that means, like, even if we think about that disabled field, right? Right now that logic is very simple. Item quantity is greater than or equal to 10. If it became more complicated, I might move it into a function, right? If it became complicated enough that it didn't make sense to inline it anymore, then I would move it out. Cool. That's a really, really helpful trick that you can just add additional helper functions as you need them. Okay, so that puts us down to kind of the first two bullets. The next thing I wanted to look at and wanted us to work through is how do we add a counter to the top of that page, right? So in the header, right now it just says shopping cart, but I like it to say how many things are in my shopping cart. Everybody good with that? So how do I figure that out? Well, if I just had the count, right, it'd be relatively easy to display it, okay? So the part of the question is how do I get there? Well, one thing you want to remember is remember that anytime the data changes, this component gets re-rendered, right? Anytime the data changes, this component gets re-rendered. We recall this function, okay? So all I need to do is figure out the count. So I can do something like function count items, right? And just count them, right? So I might do something like let count is 0, do some sort of for loop through the items array. So like const item of items. So I'm doing a for of loop. And so for each item in there, we just increment the count. So I say count goes up. We're going to add in the item.quantity. Return the count. Right? So I've got a function now that computes the count. Right? And so kind of like we just saw, I can incorporate that into UI. I just need to say, well, wherever I want that count to be shown, I can incorporate that in there. Now, I have one little problem. Like if I write this as a function, then I may actually find myself calling it more than once. Because one of the things I want to do is when it's 0, right, I want to know if it's 0, and then I also want to display it. So I may have to call it once to find out if it's 0, and then call it again to get the actual count, right? And I want to avoid doing that twice. So while we can make this a function, generally what I do is actually I would break it out, just do it directly here, knowing that this count list is going to be called every time we do it, and maybe name this something a little bit longer. So I might say this is the item count, and do something like that. So I just compute it every time. I say start the item count at 0, move through, add it up, now we've got the count. Okay. So now it's just a matter of how do I display it, right? So oftentimes when I've got multiple things in the header, one thing I will want to start doing is maybe putting those different sections in a span. So I'm going to go ahead and put the actual raw text here inside of a span tag. And I'm going to make another span for the count. So I've got 2 spans now. And so here we can say item count. So let's take a look at that. So you'll notice as I increment and decrement, that goes up and down, which is nice, right? Now, I really didn't have to do too much, right? Notice that I didn't have to go to any of the code where we add and subtract, right? I didn't have to go to the code for the plus and minus and add additional like hookups there. I just changed it and said, well, we're always going to show the item count, just here's how you compute it. Does that make sense to everybody? So it's again, this difference in mindset. We just say, declaratively, I want the count to be here, and this is how you compute it, but I don't tell you, like, when the count changes, update the header, right? I just say, hey, the header has this data in it. Okay. Now, I may want to style it a little bit. I may want to use some CSS to make this look better, because if we look at it right now, it's kind of just butting in with the shopping cart text, and it's not really looking like the way we want it to look. Okay, so that part's easy. That part's just a matter of getting the right classes on there. So on here, I might want to add some classes. So I might want to say, okay, let's make this a badge, because there's there's badges in Bootstrap is what we usually use here. So I might say, hey, this is a badge, BG primary. They've actually changed this in Bootstrap 5. It used to be badge primary. It's now gone to just BG primary for background. I can also add things like, well, let's just see what happens if I just do that. If I turn it into a badge, and you can kind of see the nice blue background and such. I need to add a little bit of spacing to move it around. So I might do, like here, I might do MS2, short for margin start 2. That's going to add a little bit of left margin and push it off. So that's, a little trick there. Other things I might also want to do is round the corners a little bit more so they're circular. So we can do that with the rounded pill class. Rounded pill will make it look a little bit more like this, which looks a little bit nicer. So part of it's just, again, getting that CSS right. I can also play around with the font size. So remember, we can do FS, short for font size, and you can get different font sizes. So like if I wanted it to be the same size as the H1, I would do FS1. If I wanted to be the same size as an H2, etc., it would be an FS2. I'm going to make this pretty small, so I'm going to go all the way down to an FS6, and then you'll kind of see it's in there and small. So that's pretty good, right? I can just play around with some classes. I can make it look pretty nice. It can go up and down as we increment and decrement, which is cool. I may also notice though that the alignment kind of looks a little bit off, right? It looks like this badge is maybe not in the right vertical place that you want it to be, right? So I might play around a little bit with that. What I do generally for vertical alignments, remember, we have this tool called Flexbox. Flexbox is like one of the very few tools in Bootstrap, in CSS, that really allows us to align things vertically. So what I'm going to do is I want to actually take the button, take that badge, and I'm going to move it towards the top alignment. Okay, so I'm going to add a few classes to the header here. Yep. Okay. You could be spelling here somewhere. Oh, because you closing a curly brace here, that's closing your function. So you need a curly brace. It's just a mismatch curly brace. Okay, so here I might want to give this something like, remember I'm usually starting with the name of the component, so this is part of the cart list, and this is specifically the header of the cart list. So I might start with, first of all, saying this is the cart list header. So if I wanted to come back later and style this with some custom CSS, that makes it easier for me to target here. I also want to add in a few things. So I might add in dflex. Okay, that's going to turn this into a flex container. If we look at it there, it's still not quite the same way. In fact, one of the things that happens as soon as I add dflex is that count actually gets stretched. Because remember, the cross alignment by default is stretch. So I need to set the cross alignment. And the way I set that across alignment is, remember, with align items. So align items, and I'm going to align it to the start, which would be the top of that flex container. And that's going to push this badge up so it kind of looks like it's up at the top there. Another thing I see, notice that our header is kind of bumping up into the top of the page. Oftentimes I want to add a little bit of margin to push it down. So I would do that with something like an MY3. That's going to add margin on the top and bottom. So we can kind of do that and it'll look a little bit better, right? So now I've got a count. It kind of looks the way I want it to look, right? So a lot of that, from there, it's just kind of playing around with the classes to get them to a place where you need them with Flexbox and margins and those kind of things, right? But actually getting the count in there is as you can see, this may be super easy. Cool. So different things we can see, right? There's side effects now happening anytime I add and subtract, right? But those side effects are kind of just, I don't have to declare them, right? So I add, and eventually we get to the point where you can't add anymore, the button's disabled, that count goes up. But all those kind of things, and same thing with going down, all those things, I didn't have to change the on-click listener. That's the big thing. That's the big thing to see there, because I didn't have to change the on-click listener, which means, and this is where this fits in when you're dealing with a larger team. Hey, Don? Hey, Don? So this is where this fits in with you're dealing with a larger team. One of your developers might be playing around with the buttons and making them disabled. Another user might be playing around over here with adding this count. And they can be working independently, or somebody might be hooking this up to talk to a database. All of those people can be working independently and not breaking each other's features, right? Which is the problem what we ran into when we were doing things traditionally with jQuery, is you said, okay, I want this to be disabled. Okay, so I have to add some code in where you load. I have to add some code in when you click the button. I may also have to add some code in to the plus button, so it re-enables the minus button, right? And now you've got all of this kind of wires together, and it becomes really hard to work together with different developers because, okay, I didn't even know that the button needed to be disabled. That was somebody else's job, right? Somebody else was working on that feature. So that really, really helps. That's one of the big reasons that's kind of driving this, is that ability to work together. Okay? Cool? All right. And really helps us when we have interactions like that with more complicated UIs. Okay, what was next on our list? So we got the header up in there in the count. Oh, another thing I wanted to do with the counter, remember, was I wanted to say once it gets down to 0, I want this counter to disappear, right? I want the actual element there, I want that to go away. Okay. What are my options? Well, one thing I could do is I could say, well, let's hide it. Let's add a D9. What are we going to say?
Are we going to do the same thing we did last time?
Yeah. Not exactly. Not exactly. So I could add a D9, right? And that would then mean I have to add another function in all these classes, right? I could do a D9. That's one route. Right? I could add a class and I could do dynamic classes. And that works. It does actually work. I could absolutely do it that way. I'm going to show you a different technique, which we use a lot more often. What I do is maybe I want to say, well, sometimes we render this element, and sometimes we don't render that element, right? Sometimes it's actually there in the HTML, and sometimes it's not there in the DOM at all, okay? So rather than just hiding it, I can actually remove it. I just need to add in some code. So I can wrap this all in a pair of curly braces, right? So I say we're going to have some sort of condition that determines we're going to conditionally render that element, okay? And you can kind of think about this as like an if statement, right? I'm going to render it if it's there, or not render if it's not there, okay? So remember that we're in expression land. We can't actually use if statements. We have to use ternaries. Okay, so I can embed a ternary in here, and I can say if item count is greater than 0, then we want this, colon, otherwise I want null. Null saying I don't want to render anything. So if I just save that and give that a try, you'll see that the count comes and goes. And sometimes that's a lot easier just from a coding and a logic standpoint. Oftentimes that's a lot easier to implement than, say, adding VM. It does come with one downside. It does come with the downside that this doesn't really support animations. So if I did want to animate it appearing and disappearing, then I would need to change classes to do that. I would need to keep the element there if I wanted to animate it coming and going. Okay, cool. Okay. So this is a really good trick, right? I can use this ternary to change what appears there. Let me show you a shorthand though, okay, because this comes up often enough. You'll notice in here that I'm saying specifically, if this is true, show this, otherwise null. Okay. So when you have that, okay, make a note of that. If you're conditionally rendering it like this, you have an expression, and you say render this element or null. There's another shorter way I can write the same thing. I can say expression and element. Which is weird, okay? This does the same effect as that, okay? Let's talk about why that is, okay? So if this is true, then it proceeds to go to the element, and this is actually the output of the expression, right? If this is true, then it proceeds to do this, and it actually evaluates to element. It doesn't evaluate to true or false, it actually evaluates to the second part. Okay, this is kind of a weirdness with JavaScript. So everybody hearing with me? We kind of have done a similar thing with the ORs. Remember to put in defaults. Okay, so if it's true, it evaluates this. If this is false, it short circuits and comes out as false. So this either comes out as false, if that one's false, or if it's true, we get the element over here, say, you know, maybe our div. So I can use this trick to conditionally render things if I just don't have anything else to render. It's either this or nothing. If you want to say A or B, like this is still the best way to do it, but if it's just strictly this is here or not, we can typically shortcut that as just this and, which is a really easy pattern to implement. I can just say item count is greater than 0 and I want to display this. So you'll see that a lot in professional examples where they're using that shortcut. Cool. Okay. That's a really, really helpful little trick we use with Ranken, is to exploit the way the and works in JavaScript. Okay. Next up, remember we want to add a button to add elements to the array, right? So we don't have that yet. So where I want to add that is kind of between the header and between the list of items, okay? Now, to keep things organized, I'm going to add some additional divs in here. That's strictly from the purpose of, well, like for instance, a button is an inline element. It's not really a block. So I want to block things out a little bit, which means I'm going to wrap a div around the items. So I'm going to say, let's open up a div here, and I'm going to move the list of items into it. Select that, drag it up. I'm going to add another div up at the top, and that's where I'm going to put my button inside. So I've got a series of block elements. I've got a header, I've got my buttons, and I've got my actual items. Everybody good with that? Okay. So in there, hey Don, wake up. In there, we want to put our button, right? So this is going to be that add item button. So we want to say this is a button class here, a button tag here. So we've got a button. The text for that button will be add item. And I need to add some attributes to that. So this is just going to be a clickable button. It's not submitting a form. So to make sure I give it type button. Okay. I also might want to style it a little bit. So maybe class name. This is maybe chart, cart list. Cart list add is the name of this. It's maybe a BTN primary to make it a primary button. I might want a little bit of margin around it, so let's go ahead and say M1. Okay. So that's just going to get the styling and the look there that I want, is to just kind of put it in there and separate it from the other two areas of the page, or the other two areas of that component. Okay. So next thing's up. Remember, I want to do some logic with this button. So I might add an on-click attribute. I say on-click. We want it to do something, right? So on-click, what would be a good thing here? So we say EVT arrow. Now I need to call this. I need to have a new method here. So maybe we say this is on add item. Pass in the event. So you click the button, and it's going to call on add item. I don't know why it wants to push it all the way over there. Okay. So we need to implement the on add item method. Okay. So go up a little bit. We've got some functions up here already. I'm going to add a new function. On add item. Takes an event, right? We don't have an item here yet, unlike some of those other ones, because the item doesn't exist yet. So again, the two things that we did, we created a method and we hooked it up to this button. So from yesterday, remember that anytime I make a change to the array, I need to make a copy of that array, right? I need to make a copy of that array. So that means I can't do, for instance, I can't just say items dot push and put a new item in there. Right? I can't just do that because React would not know that the items have changed. All cool? If I just do that, React doesn't know that the items have changed. So remember, I have to make a copy, right? So I can't do it this way. All right, I gave you two ways, right? We did this first with, we did actually three different ways. We did this, we made a copy a few different ways yesterday. So one way that we made a copy of an array is we used a for loop. You'll also remember that we I showed you can do this with the spread operator, right? Is another way we can make a copy. Or we can also do items dot map and that will make a copy of the array as well. Everybody good with that? Remember from yesterday? So this route, if I do a map, this has to always stay the same size. If I map it from this to there, it has to stay the same size. So I can't use this route to add additional things. Okay. I can, however, use this route, that spread, to add things to the array. Make sense? So I'm going to show you how to do it both ways. We're going to look at how to do it with a for loop, and I'm also going to look at how to do it with this spread operator. Okay, kind of like we did yesterday. So first things first, you remember when we used a for loop, the first thing we had to do is declare a variable. So I say const new items is equal to an empty array. Empty array. And then I loop through one by one. So let's say let I is equal to 0. I is less than items dot length. So I'm going to loop through them one by one, plus plus I. Okay. So I loop through these each one by one. And we'll also remember that in here, if I say new items I is equal to items I, that will mean I'm copying all the elements over one by one. So at the end of this, I have new items is a copy of all the items that were in there previously. So if I want to add another item to the end, I could just say new items, put in an index, right? What's the index of the next item that would go in there? Dot length, right? Because remember, if there's 3 items, there's 0, 1, 2, so the 3 isn't in use yet. So I could say items dot length is equal to something new, right? So that new element, what does the item need to have? There's 3 properties we need to have on that new item. Anybody remember what those are? What do all of our card items have? Yep, ID, name, and quantity. So ID we'll come back to. The name, I'm going to start as empty string, so they won't initially have a name. And the quantity, I'm going to choose to start their quantities at 1, so that we can later, they don't start at 0, because we want to say when they go to 0, we remove them. Okay. So I'm going to start by saying there's one of the things in there, there's one thing in there that doesn't have a name, and I need an ID somehow. Okay. What do we use for the ID? How do I come up with an ID? Remember that ID has to be unique.
Well, so far we've done IDs like 1, 2, and 3.
Yep.
So you just do items.length plus 1.
Yeah, I could do that. I could say items.length plus 1.
So in the future, this ID would it present the object ID?
Yeah. So this is going to end up being our object ID. Okay. Right? This is going to end up being our object ID. But right now we don't have all of that stuff, all that pulled in. Okay. So I can start with this, and I can say, now that we've constructed this new array of items, I can say set items to new items. So we've made a copy of all the items that were there, and then added one more item to that copy. You're squinting your eyes.
Yeah, that ID I mean, you have like duplicates, right?
We could. Yes, we absolutely could. And you're seeing the right thing. Let's try it out first, right? Yes, you're seeing the right thing, that we have a problem there. Okay, so I can add an item. That so much is good, right? It goes down there in that list. Has an ID, has a name. You'll notice that all the events are already hooked up, right? That's also one of the things we usually had to deal with in jQuery, is you add a new thing, and well, now you have to hook up all the event listeners. Well, all the event listeners are already set, right? All the button clicks, all the name changes, all of that already works. No additional code needed. That's absolutely awesome. I think for those of you that were in the summer class, how much work did it take for us to get those things to work? Right? Right? Just to get those events to work, once you added that, I think we had to add somewhere around, change maybe 10 to 100 lines to just make that work. It was hard, and several of you were troubleshooting that for a few days, just to make that happen. React, it just kind of happens for us, right? That is amazing. So you're right saying that the IDs could somehow overlap. They can't right now. They can't right now because I can't remove anything. So, this first one is 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7, and they will always say those numbers, right? There's no risk of them overlapping because, well, I can't remove any and create any gaps, okay? Which we're going to do that in a minute, right? We're going to add some functionality to remove them and then the image. But does that make sense to everybody, right? So this is the easy way to kind of say, hey, I'm going to do it with a loop. And what I want to look at now is how can I do this with using some of the other techniques, right? It turns out that this is really, really easy with the spread operator, because I can just do it like this. Set items is equal to spread the items out, ... items. So this is an array of all the items. Nothing changed. And I can just say, comma, let's add in our new item. So our new item is that items length plus 1, name blank, quantity, done.
If there is this dot push word there also.
Dot push does not work.
It does not work there? That's not working.
Well, actually, sorry. Dot push would work on line 47. Dot push in the loop. You're talking about the loop one, right?
Oh no, I'm on line 50 after the enclosing.
Yeah, so I can't do it here. I couldn't do it here per se. Yeah, and I wouldn't want to do it in this stuff. I wouldn't use push. I could have used push up here instead of doing the assignment, but no, I wouldn't use push with this push. Does that make sense? So we just say spread out all the items that are already there, add one more. So actually this is usually the way we do it, again, for the same reason we talked about yesterday, where it's shorter. Okay? But either of those patterns work, right? Whichever one makes more sense to you in your head, go for that. But this is what I'm going to be doing kind of going forward. Okay. All right. So that's adding an item. Let's check it real quick just to make sure I didn't goof anything up. All good. Okay. So the next thing to do, right, is to set it up so that we can remove things, right? And so specifically, I want to be able to remove things when we decrease the quantity to 0, okay? So if we think about that, and part of that is just not wanting to add another button for it, and that's kind of sensical anyways. A lot of users expect that behavior. So I'm going to go up to onQuantityRemove. We're going to go into this event handler, and I'm just going to say, okay, well, we're doing something right now when the quantity is greater than or equal to 0. I'm going to switch this a little bit. I'm going to say as long as the quantity is greater than 0, yeah, we still want to update the quantity. Otherwise, if the quantity is becoming 0 or negative, then I want to do something different. Okay? In this case, I want to remove the item from the array. Okay? So let's see what we can do. I'm actually going to move this console log out and move it to the end. Oh, and this should actually be on quantity remove. In here, I'm going to again start doing this with a loop, right? So I'm going to start writing this kind of the same way that we've written the one before. In fact, I can even borrow that same code. So remember that we start with an empty array, we read through, we now have a copy. Okay. So if I take this approach, I've got the same exact array that we started with, right? But what do I actually want? I want an array, I want a copy with one less thing in it. Does that make sense? I want a copy with one less thing in it. How can I get rid of that one thing? There's more than one answer. How can I get rid of that one thing? How can I get rid of that element?
Just copy all the way to the very last one and exclude it.
You said copy all the way up to the last one?
Yeah, and exclude it. So just before the
But what if I don't want to remove the last one? What if I want to remove one of the ones in the middle?
so you have to know what position it is, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. So it could be anywhere, right? The item I want to remove isn't necessarily it at the end. It could be somewhere in the middle. Maybe a splice. That's one route. Let's consider something else. Let's consider that what are the basic things we have? We have for loops and we've got if statements. Can we do it with just our basic tools of for loops and if statements? Yeah, there is a way to do it with that, right? How would we do it with those tools?
Just throw in the statement inside the for loop and check to see if the current index we're looking at name matches the item value.
And I don't want to go off the name, I want to go off of the ID. Off the ID. Because I actually haven't guaranteed that all of these items have different names. I haven't guaranteed that their names are unique. But I do want their IDs to be unique. So I can say new item, I can say if items I.id is equal to item.id, right? I can check that and say we do this. Okay. Now I'm going to add one line at the end because we're still missing that. So set items to new items. Okay. I want to test this out, right? So pause a second and watch my screen because I want to show you what's going on here. There is an issue. So I'm going to refresh. I'm going to get back here and watch. I'm going to take this one down to 0. Uh-oh. Something's not right.
Right, so there are no IDs.
There are. Yeah. So in theory, what should have happened here and what I expected it to do, notice that I'm only keeping one item. So this should have actually ended up being an array of one thing. Okay, at this point, because I'm only saying keep the one where the ID is the same. Okay. Now the problem is this actually creates an array with holes, right? It creates holes. Let's say this is at index 2, everything else is a whole, right? Or specifically all the other indexes before it are a whole. They now have a quantity of null, which is what's actually causing it to crash. They have a quantity of undefined. So one thing you may want to do, rather than copying it over this way, right, this assumes that the items are being copied to the exact same index where they are. I don't know that they're going to be the same indexes. Once I start removing things, I don't know that the index in items and new items, I don't know that those actually line up. So what I would do here instead is I would switch this over to push items I. Okay, so if I instead say push items I, we don't know which index it's going to go into in new items. It could be a different index. You're just going to add it to the end. And so then if I do minus, it's still a problem, but it doesn't crash. But notice what happens. It goes down to just being the one that I hit minus on, rather than keeping the rest of them. Right. So what I actually want to do is I want to keep the ones where the IDs don't match. Does that make sense? It's actually the backwards. I don't want to keep the items with the same ID. I want to keep the ones with different IDs. So this needs to be a not equals. So I say, if it's not the same ID, then we push it on to new items. Okay. If it's not the same ID, then we push it on to new items. And it's worth noting I would have the same problem if I was doing the equals, because I would end up, if I was doing the equals, I would end up with a gap where the item used to be. And so by doing push, it doesn't create a gap, right? If I did the previous route, which we've done here, if I go back to that, that creates a gap, which in turn causes it to crash. This is code that I probably should fix, and turns out to be pretty easy to fix. If I just go down here and I say, when we're adding this in, let's say item.quantity or 0, although not quite, that won't fix it still. That will still make it crash because item is still null. That's my problem. So if I want to be careful about these kind of things, I might check if there actually is an item, right? If I want to avoid it crashing in situations like this. So oftentimes you may put additional checks and say, well, only if item, and maybe only if there is a quantity. So item and item.quantity. That will guard against making it crash in that scenario. But even that doesn't necessarily fix it, because now we still have no ID. Right? So holes in your array, you can see, are a really big problem. Right? If you put a hole in your array, React's not going to be happy with it. So I want to be very careful about that, and using push is kind of the easy way to solve that problem. Another way you could do this, and traditionally have done too, is you can have two different indexes. And so I might have an index I and an index J. Index I is where it is in items, and index J is where it is in new items. So I might track those as two separate indexes so that I can do that there. That's another way that you can do this if you don't have access to a push method. Okay? But this gets us close enough to understand what this is going to look like as a loop. Does that make sense? So the idea is that we loop through, we push the items one by one, But rather than pushing all of the items, we only push some of the items. Okay? Does that make sense? So, there's a shortcut too. Okay? So, these ones that we've looked at so far, this is useful, right? The spread operator is useful for adding things. This is really useful for updating things because it's the same quantity. There's another method in there that's useful in this scenario. So items.filter okay. So filter says I only want to keep some of the items. It says make a copy of the array with only some of the items in it. Okay. Where map says make a copy with all of the items in it, but just turned into something else, filter says I only want to keep some of them. And so filter takes not a transformation function, but what we call a predicate. You give it an item, and it returns either true or false. If it returns true, we keep it. If it returns false, we throw it away. Okay? And our predicate's really simple. We have it right here. We say if the IDs match, we're going to keep it. Otherwise, we're going to throw it away. Okay. So the way I do this with filter is I go kind of comment this stuff out. Is I'm going to say instead of all of that, I'm going to say maybe I'll put it up at the top. I'm going to say let's set items. And that's going to be underscore dot filter items, and then I'll have kind of a lambda like we had up above. But my lambda is just that the IDs match. So I say filter the list of items, only keeping the ones, actually, I've got this backwards again. Only keep it where the ID doesn't match. So keep all the ones with a different ID and throw away the one that has the same ID. And so that should solve our problem. Okay. So that way I can do it in one round. So you can see an update's happening up here in this side with the map, and the delete's happening down here. Cool. That makes sense to everybody? Kind of tracking? Yep. So remember that we've got these three techniques to do copying. So if you're writing this down in your notes, we're using that spread to do an add. We're using this map to do an update. And we're using filter to do a remove. And you can do all those things with loops, right? If that's all you're familiar with, you can do this absolutely with if statements and for loops. It's just a lot easier if you take advantage of those things that are already pre-built. All right. Now, let's take a look at one thing that we have now. We've got two kind of outcomes of this. So one outcome of this is that I can now actually remove everything, right? So at the point where I remove everything, I want two things to happen. I want the shopping cart, the count to go away. We've taken care of that already. I also want an error message to appear here telling the user that there are no items, right? So I'm going to use that same kind of conditional rendering trick to say at this point I want to show something rather than where I said here I want to hide something, right? So here I want to show something when it gets to 0. So go back down, right? We said if item count is greater than 0 and blah, 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 blah. I'm going to add in here, I'm going to say if item count is less than or equal to 0, and here's the thing I want to show. Okay, so the message that I'm going to put there, I'm going to bring over from here. Where am I looking at? So I want a div /div, and I'm going to say your cart is empty, add items to it. Kind of be whatever error message you want it to be, but the point is I only want to render that if it's empty. And this is also the benefit of kind of having the item count in a local variable rather than a function, because I'm now using item count 1, 2, 3 places. I don't want to have to recalculate it, which would be required if I did it without a function. Cool. Okay. So let's test that out real quick. I'm going to add a little bit of styling to it here as well. So it's automatically updated. I'm going to go ahead and subtract down. It appears. And you'll also notice as soon as I add an item, it goes away. So all of that logic is just kind of, we get that for free, right? Those are things we would have to do traditionally with jQuery. I would have had to go into that onRemove item on the on quantity remove, and I would have had to say, okay, well, you sometimes need to show this if it goes to 0, and you also might need to hide that, right? And so it makes all of that code quite a bit simpler. It can look a little bit more complicated because now you have to deal with copying the array and dealing with those kind of things, dealing with the fact that the data kind of has to be immutable. But it makes a lot of side effects easier to accomplish. Cool. Okay. So one thing I want to look at now is to just style that and make it look a little bit nicer. So I might want to add some classes in here. So let's say class name. I'm going to give it my own custom class to start with, as I usually do. So we might say, hey, this is cart list empty. I'm kind of following this component style. Another thing I commonly do is I might say this is like a italic. So I might say a font style italic, and maybe font size 3. That's going to make it italic and a little bit bigger. And so those are common things I might want to play around with. Now I think I have something missing because it's definitely not. Oh, I think this is FST. Yeah, FST, not FS. Because FS is font size, FST is font style.
Okay. Does FST translate to a screen reader or not?
Does it what?
Does it translate to a screen reader?
It doesn't, but I'm okay with that. Because it's really just decorative. It's not really a change in voice, right? If I wanted it to be a change in voice, then I'd want to use an tag. So does that answer that question? Yeah. Yeah. So it really depends on what you want. Other things I might want to do is adjust the spacing a little bit. And so basically one of the things that I've missed on here is I didn't add any spacing around the middle section. So I might add like an MY3 to space that out, and maybe an MY3 on the bottom div as well. And so that kind of gets us to some consistent spacing between the different sections, which looks a lot nicer. So margins and padding are really helpful in that. So the good news is we have all the functionality in there, right? The only last thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is how do we make it look prettier, right? Is it's all working now. It's just a question of like, can we do a little bit of styling with it? So for instance, one of the things we haven't done, you saw initially with the example that there were some style sheets, some component specific style sheets. So I want to add a little bit of that back in. Both of our cart item and our cart list, neither of those have their own style sheets. I kind of like to add style sheets back in. So there's a few things I want to do and want to adjust. And go back to the beginning. So the main areas where I want to play around with and improve how it looks are really in the items themselves. Okay. So one of the things I wanted from my screen mockup is you'll notice that I wanted kind of a line between each item. Right? I wanted some sort of divider. So I'm going to add that in using top marking or top border. So I'm going to add a top border to each of them. I also want to space things out a little bit and maybe squish them, center them, make the buttons more rounded. So that's kind of what we're playing with last, is to just make that look a little bit more like what we had in our plan, right? So that's what we're playing with. Okay. So I'm going to go back to my file list. I'm going to add in a new file. We're going to call this cart item.css. Okay. So we typically call these files the same name as the JavaScript file. So you got cart item CSS goes with cart item.js. Inside of cart item.js, I need to import this file. So we're going to go up to the top, and I'm going to add import dot slash, because it's our code, cart item dot css. Okay, so you'll notice when we're bringing in CSS, we don't have that from keyword because we're not putting the CSS into a variable. We're just saying, hey, I want to include it. I want to bring it in. We're not saving it to a variable anyway. Okay. So bringing in a CSS file is as simple as that, is you just import it, and then we can start playing around with our styling. So in there, I might want to go in, see, let me pull it up on my other screen. Now, I'm going to actually let you loose a little bit on this, I think, because I did give you this on the last page. If you look at the lab handout that I gave you, I've actually given you the styling that you want to put on the product. So what I want you to do is add in the things that are listed there. So some styles we want to add to the part item. There's some style we want to add to this file. And you may find yourself needing to add some bootstrap process.
1, 2, and 3.
Oh, we are.
Yes, I was gonna say,
Yep. Because they have the same ID now. Yep. So let's finish up the CSS ability. Finish talking about that. Shorthand is we're going to change how we generate this. Okay. So let's take a look at this. There's some CSS you want to add into that card item CSS. There's also some classes that you look at the top of that part and we want to add to the card item itself. Mainly to make it a flex container and change the alignment. I was thinking that I would have something else in there.
Other preference here?
Well,
So this is kind of like that, the exception to the rule, you don't want to have inline styles, but that's kind of what this guy is.
it's not a that's the it's easy to think that it is that, and initially that means the very reverse. It's not.
Alright, inline styles, I just listen to this thing, but
Yeah, inline styles are super big problem, but they're not. The bootstrap is not inline styles.
it really is just nothing but flash styles.
What you have to understand is what is the problem with inline styles? The problem with inline styles, one of the big problems is that first of all, is that it doesn't work in responsive design. It doesn't work in responsive design because it's not overriding. It doesn't work in any place. The bootstrap styles, because they're classes and not inline styles, they are overriding and talking about responsive design. So they don't cause that problem. What they do, right, so that's one, so you can't complain about that. The other side of things is that sometimes you see it's like, well, you're duplicating it and maybe making it harder to change and override. Which, there's some truth to that, right? There's some truth to that, and then it's kind of hard to reconcile and a little bit more into balance. I think in the grand scheme of things, this is where after kind of understanding the classes and knowing what they represent, I actually have fun reading and debugging code that's done with Bootstrap when code that's done with external style sheets, because I have to constantly jump back and forth between the two things and see what styles are being written to it. In fact, their styles being spread over. Oftentimes, the style sheet in that I was 200 lines. It might be like 1,000 line file, right? So, because that's what we have to route to. That's where we do like before the is that, 1,000-line CSS file is not unusual. And then how in the world do you find out what styles are actually on the element? And then maybe spread across, like, there might be 5 different words the one element you're working with, and then you have to debug all of them.
That would be just in the development cycle, trying to figure out how you want to lay things down and then apply it simultaneously.
Counterintuitively, doing bootstrap actually leads to the styling being the same place where it's been applied. It's actually a lot easier to apply because they're not separated. And it also means that because you're having fewer things in your custom CSS file, your custom CSS file is actually easier to work with because it's fewer.
So is it friend fun to have still having a lot of custom CSS on how to bootstrap to overwrite it, or is it some people just say not to bootstrap?
Right. There's a balance. There's a balance. It's both ends. It's how custom CSS and also how bootstrap. Bootstrap is just your foundation, right? Custom CSS is how you make it. So do that, right? Use the bootstrap to give it a foundation, to give it a baseline, and then add in more custom CSS to it.
That's the way I always felt. Like to use bootstrap for the format.
So like, if you turn off your custom CSS completely, it should still be a usable application, right? It should still be a usable application if your custom CSS wasn't there. And so that's what your CSS, your bootstrap does. Is your bootstrap, you're using it to get it up to that. If you're getting it up to usable responsibilities. Then you want to use the custom CSS on top of that to make it look better and more personalized. To make it look not just cookie cutter. Like, that's where that is. Let's make it your own way.
I see, that's a good point.
Yeah, what a lot of people do is they look at bootstrap and say, well, everything's cookie cutter. Well, that's because you just did bootstrap and you offer custom CSS. Because it's going to. You're supposed to put some CSS on top of it. So, it's one thing. There's a balance. That balance is okay. Give it a little bit to a bootstrap, and then raise it to a bar.
Like that. So I read an article that said we this. But when I tried implementing bootstrap in some aspects, like for example, carousel, it was so many predefined things. It's like
Carousel is basically garbage. Carousel bootstrap is basically garbage. Throw it out in the trail.
that's I'm trying to figure out like the predefined styles. Sometimes it feels like you have to implement your own.
Part of it is the just if you look at the fairly simple for the carousel, the fairly simple for the carousel doesn't work for most cases. It's actually a horrible code. In fact, if you don't exactly follow the carousel to the letter and put some custom CSS on it, it's a much better carousel. So I've had to hack the carousel. Customize it pretty happily. So it doesn't work out in the box. Same thing with the Java phone, which is thankfully they've gotten rid of the Java phone.
Oh, they are really.
Yeah, Java phone is really wrong. So you can build your own custom CSS, but it's gotten really close where it was anyway. Forget about the size of each Java phone, just overwrite all of them because none of it is good.
So would you even apply those things from classes and those carousel classes, or would you just get the basics and make your own?
I might use them just as their kind of convention, and I would use some of like all the utility classes and things like that to get some of the things like some of the alignment or a certain kind of background color, text color, some of those kind of things. But I wouldn't necessarily use Java. It looks like your buttons are not, your buttons are stretched out. So, yeah, what you want to do is go back to here, go back to the React out. So what's happened is you haven't done one of you want to center along the color and itself, and that will be the code actually around it. So, because this code is already telling them movement 3, movement 3, that will move them around it in combination with center and everything. So, you're just missing that. Pretty good. I feel like there's too much space between the buttons. Yeah, what are the buttons themselves? Yeah, really very nice. Choosing the ground we don't. That way they're not create as much space. So you will still have this stuff in the part of the CSS. So there's some stuff about the quantity would be oh, that should be exclude probably. All the so that's it. You can see how the flow choose the background of the page. Okay. Well, think about what's defining the page. Okay. So it's got to, it's actually higher level than that. So the background of the page, first of all, what index are you about? Remember that's our shell. So if you wanted to change the back of the page, you can here, but really what you're going to do is index all CSS, right? Change that's on top of that's on top of this action. Okay. So if you want to do something page level, looking on there, reset view, because you want to center those whole things. You want to align center the targeting itself. It's a yeah, so you have that line items. Items. That's cool. It looks like you're missing space. So this valve and valve. Oh, really? That's all it did. Yeah. Because we didn't have them separated in this way. So we push that back into the now. So another thing I want to do, you see how this is kind of up there? Yeah. Right. Let's go back and look at the code. So on here, where's the so it's a good class. We want to and we'll do center. So we're going to center up. So that should move things down. It looks like the quantity in this is silent from the quality. So it looks like there's a part of the quantity. So I guess that there also works not good. That's fine. So usually I want to have which gets in there. So I'm not going to lower that. So I might go back and say, you know, I'm really going class. Oh, yeah. Both of those. So we can as for yeah. So that's just kind of both of those. So does that make sense? We got a little bit of Flexbox in there. Okay. So there's one thing that was brought to my attention that we forgot to touch, and that is that sometimes these things get to be the same ID. So if I remove the middle one, this is now, that was IDs 0, 1, and 2. Okay, if I got everybody's attention, that was 0, 1, and 2. This is now 0 and 2, right? If I add a new item, what's its ID then? 2, right? So if I add item now, I now actually have 2 items with ID 2. And that means if I start editing these, there's a problem. Okay. So what can I do? There's a few ways around this. One way around this is you could say, well, let's just keep a track of what's the next item. So that it always goes up. Instead of using the length of the array, I could say, let's store what the next number is. Another way to do this is to just ditch numeric IDs entirely, which is usually what I prefer to do, is just forget about trying to do these as numbers and just try to do them as GUIDs or randomly generated. Okay? You may remember towards the beginning of the semester we brought in a library called Nano ID. Okay? I'm going to do that same thing here. I'm going to bring in Nano ID again. So what I'm going to do to resolve that is I'm going to go to the terminal. Bring that up. So I'm going to kill my server for a minute. npm install nano ID. Okay. So rather than bringing in all with Mongo to do this task, I'm just going to bring in nano ID. Okay. And I can restart my server at that point because that's all I needed to do. So nano ID is in there now. And now I just need to use it. So that means that I need to import it. So I'm going to go to the top of the cart list. And I'm going to bring it in here. Import nano ID from nano ID. So that's my import. Okay. and I can then go use it anywhere I need an ID. So, for instance, I even want to use it when I initially create the data. So, at the beginning there, we're going to say, hey, these are nano IDs, nano ID, nano ID. And this turns out that it really just kind of works because the code we've written didn't really say anything about the fact that it needs to be numbers. It actually still works even if they're strings, which is what nano ID is giving us, is a string instead. So those three I create as nano IDs. And then when we add a new item, which is down here, I bring that in. I create a new nano ID when I add that in. And so that means I don't have the problem of like add and remove things. Subtract this one, add a new one. And these are actually distinct because they have different IDs. So problem solved, right? So it just basically comes down, we don't ever want to really, it basically always a bad idea to use the length of an array as the ID of an item. Because you have to remember to bring it in the curly braces. So in import, you have to remember to say curly braces. I'll do that. Because it's kind of weird that Nano ID did this, but they did do that. If you don't have the curly braces here, then you're going to get that error, which is what Michael just saw. Is that it can't import blah, 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 because there's no default export. And that's actually what you saw at the end of the document. We're saying export default app, right? They're saying there's no export default Nano ID. So that's why we have to put in those curly braces and destructure it, is because there's no default export. Okay. I think that was it. I think we have a working example. Was there anything that comes to anybody's mind that we haven't touched from what we have here? I mean, I think I haven't added in all of the styling that you guys did, but I think we're there. Any questions? Okay, so that's kind of the end of this example here. One of the things I wanted to do, as well as this, is also look at kind of how to do the pet adoption agency is. I don't really feel like we have time to get through that today or this week. Remember that Evan's going to come in and kind of run the class tomorrow. So he'll be kind of in charge. He'll be looking after you guys. Huh? No, I moved the test to Monday. You missed that. So I moved the test back to Monday, and I'm actually going to give you more than 1 day for it. So I blocked off both Monday and Tuesday for that. So for tomorrow, I've got another lab for you guys. If you go out to Inside Ranken, you're going to find out that there's a lab 6.2. Should look like this. It's up on the main page. I think I still need to add it under assignments. So there's the link to Lab 6.1 and Lab 6.2. I will be adding those under assignments. But this is what I want you guys to be working on tomorrow. Is you're going to get started on your issue tracker project. Okay. We haven't talked about how to connect things over the network yet, so I don't want you to do that yet. Okay. I want you to be connecting to your API yet. We'll talk about that next week. Okay. But this week you're just going to work with local data, arrays, and fields and state, rather than bringing in the database and all of that yet. Cool. So which lab are you talking about? Okay, so 602 is going to be due. Let me go look at the calendar and update that there. So we've been working through 601, and I think we've just finished that one up. 6.2, we're going to start that tomorrow, and my expectation would be probably here, around there is where that'll be due. Because we have a few things going on next week. So we've got the test. We've got the test next week. We've got 2 days in between there. We also have a holiday. So I think where the due date for 6.2 is going to land is here, because of all of the other things happening next week. Is that good? Yeah. So somewhere in there we need to talk more about like some of the practices that we do. But hopefully this is enough to kind of get you started, right? So we talked about how to add things, we talked about how to remove things, we talked about how to update things and kind of play around with that. We've looked at some different components, so like we need a card item component, we need a card list component, we hooked that in with the application. I showed you how to conditionally hide things and show things. So you're going to need that. So for instance, like probably the first thing that users going to see is going to be like the login page or the registration page, and then you'll have to like hide it and go to the next thing, right? So you've got some of those pieces in place. Okay. Questions? Looking good? Yeah.
It's all just like one HTML file.
Yeah. Yeah, it's all going to basically be one page. From the browser's perspective, it's all really one page. There is something called React Router, which we might want to take a look at eventually here. React Router kind of gives you a way to make it look like the route's actually changing and like the URL is actually changing, and they're actually traversing to different pages, even though technically it's all still on the same page. It just looks like it's going to different URLs. So we may want to look at that, but you can definitely get this up and running without that. Okay, so you're going to kind of design it as if it was all on one page. Okay, so that's where I stand. If you haven't yet, definitely add me on to your repository, so I have access to this React part repository, so I can kind of look over it and grade it. But if you're done with this, you can commit it and go on to 6.2, which will ask you to create a new repository for this. I'll go ahead and commit my code. And we're done. I'm going to hit stop.